Hello and welcome to the Canadian Culture Corner. I'm Joe. This next segment, I guess you could say, this playlist will be one of Abandoned Projects by Dan and I. This was written over the course of quite some time. We had dreamt of, thought, discussed, bickered, and generally decided that, on the format, and we wrote it with a great deal of detail. Well, I wrote the drafts, Dan edited, supervised a lot of details, and this involved a lot of movie watching, a lot of cartoon watching, a lot of comic book reading, novel reading, anything that had to do with Superman's first few years and his origin story. And the thing is, the problem with the project was it eventually blew up. The style that would have been utilized was the one of our Dragon Ball Z fanfic. And for anyone who's read that fanfic knows that it's too long. It's one thing to do one story like Dragon Ball Z with a beginning, middle, and end, and one or two expanded stories. But to do this for an ongoing, almost overlarge universe with thousands of comics and stories and whatnot, like the post-crisis Superman universe and whatnot, was too much. And what's more is we had planned for it to expand into all the different heroes of Marvel and DC, with each one having hundreds of thousands of chapters. And hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of pages to each of them, so that we'd capture every individual story that was ever written, expand on it, blow it up into at least 1,000-page novels each of the hero almost. Now, it might sound fanciful and stupid for us to have dreamt of doing this, but at the time, with the writing style, it was only about a month, and we were able to do hundreds of pages per story, and it seemed feasible. But then, since then, as we've been working on our own universes and projects and whatnot, and on this channel, and as life's overtaken us, we've become aware we can't. By the time we'd reach even the death of Superman, the story, we'd be at the end of our lives. So, here we are. The abandoned first draft of the Death of Krypton, as recreated. So I'm just going to remind people, though, at the end of this week, we're going to have a live stream with Renaissance Nerd. And here we go. I'm going to read the first maybe 5 to 10 pages, and each video will go from there, once a week, with 5 to 10 pages each. The Death of Krypton. It doesn't matter anymore. Farewell, Krypton. Brainiac's final farewell to Krypton and its inhabitants, taken from Superman the Animated Series, Episode 1, The Last Son of Krypton, Part 1. Now is the winter of Krypton's discontent. With the sun ready to set upon its day, despite the best hopes of many, none could reverse this fact. Where many would feel the hopelessness of this foul day, none would or could fight so hard, half as hard as noble Jor-El of the House of El. Where some such as Zod would see opportunity in Krypton's fall, Brainiac a chance for a new life, and Zor-El something to flee from, Jor-El would seek to do what none others hoped to do, save Krypton from herself. Thus our tale begins, just as the curtain of this act is nigh ready to be closed upon valiant Jor-El of the fair house of El and Krypton itself. Across a sea of stars, across a universe warred over by Thanagar, Gordania, and Tamaran, across a cosmos guarded by the great keepers of peace and guardians of justice, the Green Lantern Corps of legend, were dashed some of the last of Jor-El's hopes as he reluctantly made his way back to his science vessel from the deepest hole in the polar ice cap of Krypton. The trouble of gathering data from the core was not simply ensuing ensuring that one's probes endured the heat of Krypton's core, or the creatures that seemed to gravitate to every grotto and cavern that was used to get to the core, but the uncomfortable suspicion that the animals which had once been more afraid of Kryptonians than vice versa, may have been affected by an innate sense of wrongness with the planet. Sometimes Jor-El had the impression that some of the animals were directly targeting him, where they once targeted everyone in his research team. It was a nagging feeling that he could never quite shake, and one that grew with every excursion into the wilderness he and Lara Lorvan undertook. The rest of his colleagues, those that still remained and had not been frightened off, banished or killed, were as visibly weary as ever. They felt that his hypothesis was one that was either very likely and that it was far past time to flee, as Zor-El had done, to Kandor, or to simply give up on the thesis. They were all tired, and his recent attack that had ended with their numbers being decreased from 5 men to 2 had shaken them all. Much as he wanted to reassure them, to maybe speak to Kordan or Sarai Abra-Rel, Jor-El knew that they needed their space. The former had just lost his best friend, while the latter had lost her brother. Both hard losses. Losses that weighed on Jor-El's own soul. Both losses were his fault, all the others were. But the worst part wasn't the losses they had suffered, but the fact that they had learnt precious little from this outing. They had just to say managed to get the probes near the edge of the core, where it had begun to record and relay data to Jor-El's ship, with a 5-man team out in the frozen northwest, with all 5 of them manning different probes, when, one after another, they either began to fail, or in the case of 2 of them, which were custom-built, they were attacked, with one of them killed, and Jor-El barely escaping the Shagat, a flying tendril animal which ate as much as it tended to crush between its 2 mighty pink tendrils. Jor-El was too deep in his grief, in his most recent failure to find sufficient proof for what he knew to be right around the corner, to notice the computer terminal behind him flare suddenly to life. The emblem of the 3 circles, meant to represent the union of the 3 most important parts of Krypton society, the military caste, the ruling council, and the now powerless worker castes, which comprised all the rest of the castes. There was supposed to be a union of all 3 castes, but in more recent time, the 3 great circles, which represented Krypton society, had come to signify something much, much more influential than most of Krypton society. Brainiac. "Good afternoon, Jor-El," said a distinct, cultured, if icy cold voice that pierced through the head of the fallen L House and his grief. He must have leaped 30 feet in the air at the sound of Brainiac's voice. Something he felt certain was why the AI had flicked onto the screen in the main break room so quietly. Built some 5 centuries ago, Brainiac was a piece of the most sophisticated technology Krypton had ever built. Wildly capable and brilliant, he was also something of a nightmare to deal with for a member of the science cast. Controlling, gluttonous, and intolerant of advice, the icy-natured AI had little use for organic advice, or so was Jor-El's experience. Jor-El had heard that centuries ago, Brainiac had been kindly, prone to hurrying to please his Kryptonian masters, but somehow he doubted it. Actually, the thought was enough to make him snort in derision. Today, though, he was fresh out of humor and even more out of civility. His grief and anger at what he had lost to that monster out there made him whip around and react even more shortly than usual. "Brainiac!" Jor-El greeted him unhappily, never very pleased to see the AI that all but truly ran all of Krypton. When he was younger, Jor-El had admired the machine, had dreamt of working on its circuitry or under its all-seeing wing. That was before he had been forced to work with him in close quarters for nigh on 22 years. All enthusiasm by now had long since died. What an unpleasant surprise! Whenever he spoke to the AI, the scientist couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl up and down his spine. He also couldn't repress the thought that the machine knew more than he ever let on, that it saw through him better than his own father's piercing glower had tended to. Yet in spite of this instinctive dislike and discomfort on his part, he could not help but raise his chin defiantly each time he saw Brainiac's representation on one of the screens that decorated every room, it seemed, of Krypton. That defiant side of him often surprised those fresh out of the academy, and also never failed to earn a scowl from his father-in-law, a weary sigh from Lara, and a bewildered frown from Zor-El. Thoughts of his younger brother awoke in the 40-year-old, an intense desire to suddenly abandon Krypton, to leave it and head for its colony in the neighboring star system. Anything to see his younger brother, and even his warm-hearted niece. But the thought of Allura in Z was enough to make him rethink the temptation and decide that dealing with Brainiac, Zod, and a potentially dying planet was infinitely preferable. Quite what Zor-El saw in her was beyond Jor-El, just as Jor-El's feelings of revulsion towards her were beyond his baby brother. "I'm awaiting your data," Brainiac told him simply, his voice unable to demonstrate any emotion, or so it always seemed to most. To Jor-El's ears, there was a distinct coldness in its voice whenever it spoke to him, or when it used to speak to his brother. This, along with the emotional exhaustion of having lost 3 good scientists, made him bristle. "Have you been spying on me and my crew with your satellites again? The ruling council and science cast demand that I analyze your data as soon as you obtain it," was the prompt response to his heated question. There was a slight inflection of amusement somewhere in the supercomputer's voice. Much as he would have liked to tell Brainiac where to put the data, and even more where to put his ruling councils and science casts, the middle-aged Kryptonian knew better. Any defiance would be reported to the ruling council, which, in all its frightened paranoia, would likely have him banished to the Phantom Zone, while the science cast and its leader, Khan Z, Allura's cousin, and easily one of the greatest wastrels and nuisances to have ever walked Krypton's surface, would likely gleefully have Jor-El declared an outcast, which would make him liable to be sent to a detention camp or executed. Biting his tongue, he took the data matrix that he had taken from his probe's controller and pressed it into one of the terminal's openings, feeling what little data he and his people had found, feeding him what little data and his people had found. Still, he couldn't resist at least one small scolding. "Brainiac, somewhere in all those trillions of file clusters, there's got to be one that says people don't like being spied upon." Brainiac's answer was confused, with a hint of derision beneath that surface, one that brought a larger frown to the scientist's lips. "Then why did they create me?" For that, Jor-El had his own answer, but it was one that he saved for after he had found the exact file folder to file this information inside of Brainiac. A question I often ask myself. After a heartbeat, during which he bit his tongue once more to keep from saying more, he added, "Transmission set. It's feeding time." Brainiac was silent, was a moment, long enough for Jor-El to wonder if perhaps his off-the-cuff remark had attracted Brainiac's interest. Before he could get nervous, under the AI scrutiny, though, he received his answer. "Data received." There was another moment, a beat before Brainiac disappeared, where Jor-El felt once again the certainty that Brainiac was examining one, probing possibly for weaknesses. This unnerving staring contest soon ended, as Brainiac vanished with a small noise. Now that Brainiac was gone, the son of the House of El felt his previous defiance and irritation creep back in as he huffed, "You're welcome, glutton." How he hated that smug piece of technological trash. Not that he would ever be able to tell him that, given what it would cost him to say such a thing. But would it matter? A dark voice whispered into the back of Jor-El's mind as he recalled his current status, where once he had been Krypton's most revered scientist, the source of admiration and envy amongst all of Krypton's sons and daughters, only for his status to have reached rock bottom as his predictions of Krypton's doom grew steadily more frequent. After his predictions had begun to trickle, then flood in, The more he studied his homeworld, the less he was respected or even tolerated amongst his peers and people, with those who had believed him preferring to transfer to Kandor, where society was slightly laxer and that ruling council's authority wasn't anywhere near as ironclad. Such thoughts usually faded swiftly enough, as Jor-El refused to consider them for very long, given that he knew deep down he did indeed have a great deal to still lose. He still had his son, for punishments on Krypton tend to extend to one's wife and children. Such was the severity of her laws and the absoluteness of the society it had built for itself. A quiet bark startled Jor-El, who jumped a little just as a small puppy hurried over, only to be followed after by a crawling infant who struggled after the cheery pup. While the dog rubbed itself against him, Jor-El felt a smile reluctantly crawl onto his face as he remembered what it was exactly he was fighting for. With a small laugh, he reached down just as the dog danced around him, and Kal-El, the light of his life and source of all joy in it, crawled on over after Krypto. "Hey, Cal, what do we have here? Shouldn't you be with your mother?" The baby whined as he was picked up, arms reaching out for his father's face, which was, for some reason, a source of fascination for the child. It never ceased to amaze Jor-El how fast his son had grown in the past week since he was born, with the infant frequently prone to weeping, to crawling off, anything to see his father. According to Lara, he tended to pitch fits whenever his father left and wouldn't calm down for hours, with Jor-El unsure of what to make of this trend. On the other hand, he had observed how his son hated to be separated for extended periods of time from his mother as well. With the one time Lara had to go rest, leaving Kal-El in his care, the baby wouldn't calm down until his mother had returned to reassure the baby that she was there also. "I think he has received his need for attention from you, Jor." Lara was prone to joshing in her lilting voice, giggling that laugh that had so enamored Jor-El all their lives. Today, though, was a different day than 3 days ago. Lara, who was still recovering from giving birth, as one of the only women to have ever done so in centuries on Krypton, which, though not forbidden, was still frowned upon on Krypton. Now that's the end of page 5. I'm going to stop there because my throat's tired, I'm tired, and I think the video is getting long. I'm going to keep reading it 5 pages at a time from here on out, and as you could see, there was a considerable influence from the animated series, from Man of Steel, from, I don't know if it shows, but the Richard Donner Superman, the comics, Man of Steel from, by John Byrne. The thing is that while there's 100 pages to the prologue, which is just about the death of Krypton, this would have been the first chapter of a mixedverse involving the greatest of Marvel and DC's heroes, as stated before. And it was just unfeasible. It was unfeasible. So, as I'm no longer young and foolish enough to think I could write this, I just decided, and Dan agreed, that we should read this. So, if you like this video, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. And stay tuned for next week, when we'll have another of these videos ready for you. And do share the video, as it'll greatly help with that algorithm and with encouraging us to make more of these episodes. And we're going to be starting with this abandoned project and moving on to making an audiobook edition when the time comes of Dan's Digimon fanfic, which I find I prefer that project. It's simpler, there's more childlike joy in it, and, well, it's just funner. It was funner in some ways. Now, as I said, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, and up and away, I guess, to infinity and beyond.